So, Paul Golin, welcome to our city congregation, and we are looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us about the rise of Christian nationalism. As you know, my background itself kind of touches on this issue. Coming from this Christian background myself. So it's going to be very interesting for me to hear what you have to say to us and for us to learn. So I'm going to hand it over to you now, Paul.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for that lovely service and welcome. And for those of you who may not know, although I think everyone does, but I always want to acknowledge that there may be some newcomers. The Society for Humanistic Judaism is the umbrella organization for congregations like City Congregation in New York. There's about 32 groups. Some are very small, some are large with rabbis, some don't have rabbis, throughout the US and Toronto. So that makes this international. We actually also have independent members of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. And until you blew up my frame, I didn't realize that you can see my luggage in the corner there. I'm visiting friends in, no, you can keep me blown up. Visiting friends in Florida, trying to get a little warmth. Not succeeding, like 50 degrees down here, but still better than the 14 that I left in New York. So as the organizing body for humanistic Judaism in the US, when I came on, I asked, what kind of social justice do we do as a movement? Because that's how many secular Jews engage with their Jewish identity. And there wasn't a specific program. So we launched a little over 5 years ago, Jews for a Secular Democracy. And this is not just for humanistic Jews. We felt like these were issues that we were going to address that are relevant and should speak on behalf of all Jews. So this is a pluralistic initiative around bringing Jewish perspective to separation of church and state. So today I'm going to speak about white Christian nationalism. And I've done a lot of presenting on Jews for Secular Democracy and what our overall goals are, but this will be my first time presenting specifically on white Christian nationalism. So I created a PowerPoint that I'm going to share. I didn't time this out. It could be 30 minutes. It could be 3 minutes. We're going to find out. It won't be 3 minutes, but it will probably be somewhere around 30 minutes. And so a little bit of background about Jews for a Secular Democracy. The mission is to mobilize Jewish voices for religious freedom. Through education and advocacy and informed by pluralistic Jewish values and traditions, we defend the separation of religion and government. And some of the big issues that we see related to religious encroachment on what should be a secular democracy are reproductive rights and women's equality, LGBTQ equality, secular education. We're going to talk a bit about prayer in school, in public schools, etc., and religious pluralism, right? The rights for everybody, whether religious or secular, to be able to express their identity as they wish, regardless, as long as it doesn't impact on other people. And so in always talking about this, we sometimes talk about who it's being defended from, but this presentation is going to very specifically dive much deeper into what we mean by white Christian nationalism. And by the way, there will be lots of time at the end for Q&A. So if something comes up, put it in the chat. I can't see it right now because it's PowerPoint, but I will look at it after or write it down and remember it, and we'll have a conversation. But I wanted to kind of throw all the info at you up front, and then we can talk about it. So there are a variety of definitions of white Christian nationalism. I've pulled out a couple. This one is from Christians Against Christian Nationalism, which is a great organization. And in its name itself, you can see that Christian nationalism is not a blanket statement for all Christians. And in fact, it is not even necessarily the majority of Christians. And that's an important point to keep in mind. So their definition of white Christian nationalism is it's a cultural framework that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. Christian nationalism contends that America has been and should always be distinctively Christian from top to bottom in its self-identity, interpretation of its own history, sacred symbols, cherished values, and public policy. Another definition or explanation is by the author, Dr. Jemar Tisby, who writes, and it's an ethnocultural ideology that uses Christian symbolism to create a permission structure for the acquisition of political power and social control. I think that's really important to keep in mind as well. We're not talking about a religion here. We're talking about a political ideology and a power play, really. So some of the key aspects of white Christian nationalism, and, you know, I guess trigger alert, too late. This is a photo from the insurrection. This guy inevitably has been pardoned, but there were a lot of Christian symbolism at this insurrection, and many of the leaders and people involved were Christian nationalists. So the base for this movement and its leaders are primarily white evangelical Protestants. The history of it, which I'll touch on in the next slide, is more about race than religion, and I'll get into that. And it's certainly, as I said, more about politics than religion. Something you may or may not have heard of is this idea of dominionism, that Christians should be at the top of 7 mountains of society. It calls for believers to take control over 7 leading aspects of culture, which are family, religion, education, media, entertainment, business, and government. And they want to control all these aspects. And white Christian nationalism has always been a hyper-masculine, militaristic version of Christianity. There's lots of other things intertwined. This prosperity gospel, that, if you are a billionaire, it's because God has shined favor on you, that people get what they deserve. And if you are prosperous, that's because God favors you, etc. It's important to note that there is white nationalism as well as Christian nationalism, and those are somewhat different, but the end goals are kind of the same. So white nationalists are the Klan, right? The people who will say the white race is superior, and they'll be upfront with it, and they'll throw the Nazi salute, and they are very easy to identify, whereas Christian nationalism is much more coded, and they will kind of obfuscate their ultimate, I think, racist and search for power over everybody else in code, and try to seem diverse. Like, for example, regularly using the phrase Judeo-Christian, right? I think there are still today many Jews who feel like when they hear that phrase, the Judeo-Christian tradition, or we need as Americans to have Judeo-Christian values, that is inclusive of us Jews, but it's not. And we can talk a bit more about that, but it is cover for their what many other Christians consider distorted views on women, on reproductive rights, on when life begins, and so on. And the movement is inherently anti-democratic, which is also why I have this picture from the insurrection, because they know they are the minority as far as their viewpoint, and they don't care. They want to rule by minority, so they are going to suppress the vote and try to prevent the diverse and pluralistic American electorate from truly expressing what it wants. I want to point you to a webinar that is up on our YouTube channel that we did with Dr. Bradley Onishi, who wrote a great book, Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism. He does a great job explaining how this all emerged. So again, white power, white nationalism has always been with us. You can say it's America's original sin, right? Even before the founding of America, with slavery, with only people who could originally vote were white holders, and so on. And much of the history of America is everyone else fighting for their rights. And so when they talk about making America great again, I think a lot of them have in mind this time when only white Christian men genuinely had power. But Christian nationalism, where Christianity was used to express these ideas and goals, really accelerated, began in the late 19th, early 20th century when they wanted to close the mostly open borders from immigrants coming into the United States. I don't know if you have you may have a similar family history. One side of my family came to the US in the 1880s in that wave of Jewish migration fleeing pogroms in Russia. They were from Ukraine, the Pale of Settlement, where for the most part, millions came from there to the US because they were able to. The other half of my family, almost all of whom died in the Holocaust because they could no longer come to the US because of laws that were set up to prevent them because of this movement for white power, really. In the 40s and 50s, some people think "In God We Trust" has always been our national motto, has always been on our currency. I hope you know that that is not true and that it didn't start happening until we needed to counter the godless communists. And that was an opportunity for Christian nationalists to start putting God everywhere that they possibly could. But the real accelerant for what we are experiencing today with Christian nationalism was desegregation, right? So obviously, the South did lose the Civil War, whether they want to acknowledge it or not. And Reconstruction was a disaster, turned into a disaster. Segregation was the law of the land in the South. And once it was finally dismantled, whites began moving their kids out of public schools to avoid desegregation and created Christian academies. And the government finally said, you will not be tax exempt if you keep these schools segregated. And that was kind of the kickoff of what is today's white Christian nationalist movement. So a lot of people think what really kicked it off was Roe v. Wade, but which made abortion legal. If you look at who was supporting Roe v. Wade when the Supreme Court made abortion legal, there were many, many churches that supported it, and then ultimately came to renege. The ideology of life beginning at conception was not a thing in the early 20th century. And so what happened was these white Christian nationalists recognized that it was not popular and not politically correct to say, we want segregation back, right? And again, this is the difference between white nationalism, the Klan is still fine saying that behind the secrecy of their white sheets, but Christian nationalists, they needed additional wedge issues. And so in the 80s, they recognized that abortion was a key wedge issue, along with other culture war issues like the gay rights movement, which accelerated in the 90s. So now they have successfully distanced themselves from the racism that really still underpins their movement, and they make it about abortion, they make it about LGBTQ. But I encourage you to go watch the interview with Dr. Onishi, who does a much better job explaining how this all came about and how racism really is the thing that underpins so much of the movement that we're experiencing today. And if you didn't know that, you probably still were already seeing it in how it manifests, but it becomes that much more powerful and more obvious. So I want to dive into some numbers around who and how many Americans are white Christian nationalists. And a great organization is called Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI. They did a survey of 22,000 Americans in I think it was 2022, and the numbers were released in 2023. And they created a rubric whereby they used 5 questions, and based on how many of these you agree with, determines whether or not and what kind of Christian nationalist you might be. So these statements that people agreed or disagreed with are: God has called Christians to exercise dominion. Remember, there's that word again, dominionism, over all areas of American society. 20% of these Americans surveyed agreed with that. The US government should declare America a Christian nation. 27% agreed. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. 30% agreed. If the US moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. 38%. And US law should be based on Christian values. It's 40%. And you'll note that none of these are over 50%. None of these are the majority. I'm trying to look for things to be hopeful about, and that is one piece of it. So then PRRI took the answers to these 5 questions and created 4 categories of Americans as far as how they relate to Christian nationalism. So folks who overwhelmingly agree or completely agree with all or 4 out of 5 of those, they call adherents. They adhere to Christian nationalism. Those who agree with many but not all, or are less likely, less strongly agree, are called sympathizers to Christian nationalism. And then those who disagree but not completely disagree are called skeptics. And then those who completely disagree are called rejectors. I'm hoping that everyone on this call is a rejector, but happy to hear from anybody else after we go to Q&A. But I thought this was an interesting way to break it down. Obviously, this is not a hard and fast factual thing, but I think it gives a really nice way of kind of understanding how do Americans relate to this ideology. And, ooh, I didn't do this. Okay. So how does this break down? 3 in 10 Americans qualify as either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers, right? Adherents are only 10%, right? The hardest hardcore white Christian nationalists, only 10% of Americans, and the folks who sympathize with them are another 20%. So that's a third of Americans, right? Nowhere close to a majority, compared to 2/3 of Americans who qualify as either skeptics or rejectors, right? There are as many rejectors combined as there are both adherents and sympathizers. To me, this kind of middle ground, the 39% who are skeptics, those are the folks we got to get to, right? And maybe some of the 19% who are sympathizers. We're not going to necessarily flip any of the adherents, but they're only 10%. Talk more about that as we go. And how about how this breaks down by religion? So, and I'm sorry if this is hard to see on your screen, so I'll just kind of note that at the very top are white evangelical Protestants. 29% of them are adherents of Christian nationalism, and another 35% are sympathizers. So the majority of white evangelical Protestants are white Christian nationalists, and of course, that is the base of the GOP and Trump today. And then under that, they break down Protestants of color. So you'll see a few lines below white is Black Protestants, and 14% of them are adherents to Christian nationalism, right? And this is often used by folks who say, well, how can it be white Christian nationalism if you've got 14% of Black Protestants and who are adherents and another 24% who are sympathizers? That is, over a third of Black Protestants. But there is a difference in how they see Christianity and America, but it is certainly troubling and means that we have bridges to build and work to do. And then if you go all the way down to the bottom, you got Jewish, and with surveys like this, even though they reach 22,000, it's often unless you're specifically looking to survey Jews, it's really hard because Jews are only 2% of the US population to make definitive statements about Jews in these kind of surveys. That said, there are 2% of American Jews who are adherents to Christian nationalism and another 5% who are sympathizers. It's pretty low. But there's still, 6 or 7% of them who think America should be a Christian country. I don't know if you know any Jews who would agree with that. I don't. And then under that is unaffiliated, which doesn't necessarily mean atheist agnostic, but they would fall into the unaffiliated. And it's even low with only 1% who are adherents to Christian nationalism and 6% who are sympathizers. Getting back to that difference in race, they drill down on that and they ask questions about race. And so they ask, do you agree with or disagree with certain statements? So this first one is that generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for many Black Americans to work their way out of the lower class. Do you disagree with the statement, basically, that there is a legacy of slavery that impacts African Americans today? Of all Americans, 45% disagree with that statement, but among Christian nationalist adherents, 70% disagree with that statement. And then it goes down, and here's the difference, right? All adherents of Christian nationalism still have a majority, 70%, but of white adherents of Christian nationalism, it is 83% compared to 46% of Black adherents to Christian nationalists, right? So we're talking about the 10% of the most hardcore Christian nationalists, which a very few number of African Americans who fall into that category. And of them, less than half would disagree with the statement that slavery has had an ongoing impact. But this is the difference between white Christian nationalism and the Black community, it's Black community and not all people of color, and what the difference is. So some of these other questions also drill down, and you can really see the difference between that third and fourth lines on all of these, that the white adherents to Christian nationalism really hold a lot of racist views. So the other questions are, today, discrimination against white Americans has become as big a problem as discrimination against Black Americans and other minorities. 85% of adherents to Christian nationalism agree with that ridiculous statement. A Black person is more likely to receive the death penalty for the same crime. 72% of Christian nationalists who are white disagree with that statement, only 46% who are Black, and so on. White supremacy is still a major problem in the US today. Do you disagree with that? Those who disagree with it, again, big discrepancy, 66% of white Christian nationalists disagree with the statement, white supremacy is still a major problem in the US today. Seems like a majority of Americans overall disagree with that, agree with the statement, white supremacy is still a major problem in the US today, right? Only 32% of all Americans disagree with that statement, which is encouraging. And now I know you want to break it down by political party, and I know that's going to be a big shock to you, but there are way more Christian nationalists who are Republicans than independent or Democrat. It doesn't mean there are no Christian nationalists as measured by the answers to those original 5 questions, right? 5% of Democrats are the hardcore adherents of Christian nationalism, and 10% are sympathizers. But compare that to 21% and 33% of Republicans, right? You've got more than half of Republicans who are white Christian nationalists by the definition of this survey. One of the issues we should think about is that many Americans have not even heard of Christian nationalism. And when we started Jews for Secular Democracy, I did a search. You can use Google to search a website, and I searched the Jewish Forward website for the phrase Christian nationalism, and maybe 2 articles came up. It was not written about in the Jewish media 6 years ago. And that's scary and disturbing. It's got a lot more coverage since then. And I think there was a discomfort among Jews and the Jewish community to name it because it has the word Christian in it. And we don't want to look like we're attacking our Christian neighbors, because again, this is a political ideology, not a religion, and it does not speak for all Christians, as we just saw with the reverend who gave the talk to our new president 2 days ago, right? So of all Americans, 37% have not heard or don't know or didn't want to answer questions about Christian nationalism. And even among adherents, 38% don't have a name, have not heard of it. But you can see that the green is they feel that it's an unfavorable expression, and blue is that they feel it's a favorable expression. And those who reject or are skeptics, obviously, who know what the phrase means, are find it very unfavorable, right? 71% of the rejectors find the phrase Christian nationalism very unfavorable. So the folks who know it, who know what it is, know where they stand, but there's this huge middle group of folks who don't even know the phrase yet and can't define it. What is their issue, and why do we care? And again, I'll point you to another conversation that we had through Jews for Secular Democracy by somebody who can be much more articulate about this than me. We had a great conversation with Rabbi Jay Michelson, who, if you're not following him in social media, he really is a brilliant person who writes about all kinds of things related to Judaism and politics and what's going on in this country. So I really encourage you to watch that. He wrote a piece about Project 2025 last summer that really, and I hope you've all heard about Project 2025. It was a massive 800-something page document written by the Heritage Foundation, the ultra-conservative Christian Nationalist organization, and a whole lot of allies that basically understood that the last time Trump got elected, they missed a tremendous opportunity because they thought there was no way he was going to win. And when he did win, they were just completely disorganized. So they felt like, let's have a plan going in on day one. And the reason why Trump just signed crazy number of executive orders over his first few days is because it was all mapped out already by these folks, these coalition of Christian nationalists, to implement their agenda. And their agenda includes a lot of things that we're all going to be very upset about. But I listed just a few. Again, if you go read the article by Jay Michelson, he touches on some more, and we talk about it in the interview with him. But obviously, they want to end abortion. And they want to prosecute those who aid and abet it. They are going to have a chilling effect on abortion, not just in the states that have banned it, but across the country. They want to absolutely turn back progress on LGBTQ equality and end gay marriage. I would say, when people ask me who is on the front lines right now, I would put our trans friends and family as absolutely the front of the front line, and I'm terrified for them. Prayer in public, putting prayer in public schools and taking out money from public schools to put into religious schools, major part of their agenda. They are looking to replace so much of our federal government from professionalized individuals to their lackeys. And bottom line, they want to return white Christian men to the place of privilege that they had when this country was founded. That's all this anti-DEI talk and so on is really about. Like, nobody in this country has had more of an unfair leg up than white men. And, yet when everyone else has at least attempted to get close to it, now this is the radical backlash that we're facing. So, this just is tip of the iceberg. The document is massive, and there are so many things they're going to try to do, and they won't be successful on all of it, I hope, but there will be a lot of unfortunate turning back the clock on so many of the things that we've made progress on in this country over the last decade. I saw this meme and I thought it was relevant. Just don't worry. As long as you aren't LGBTQ or Black or Hispanic or Jewish or Muslim or Arab or Asian or atheist or disabled or female or poor, you're going to be fine. Right? Who does that leave? How about the Jews? So, besides Project 2025, the same group put out a document called Project Esther, which, if you haven't heard of it, you can Google it, and it's the top result. It's on the Heritage Foundation website. It is ridiculous. It is an attempt to fight anti-Semitism, ostensibly, by these white Christian nationalists, and it is awful. They have a lot of very pro-Zionist views, which I think a lot of Jews feel good about and happy to have them as allies and feel like we have to take allies wherever we can. But I encourage folks who feel that way to dig deeper on what is really happening with their support of a very right-wing government in Israel and why right-wingers all across the world are excited about what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing and what he's been enabled to do. And we already know how much Netanyahu has interjected in support of Trump the first term and during the election and so on. So there's a love affair there between far right leaders, but it doesn't extend to actual American Jews, right? Who we remember Trump has said multiple times that we are disloyal, that he doesn't understand why we wouldn't vote for him, and so on. And a big part of it is just this racist, nationalistic idea that America is for white Christians and Israel is for the Jews. And so you got your own country, right? Trump said your prime minister to American Jews talking about Netanyahu. He's not my prime minister. So it's very scary what their philo-Semitism is, which is really anti-Semitism. And it's really important to understand that. And that perhaps is a whole other conversation. If you go to look at Project Esther on their website, first of all, the goal is clearly weaponize any anti-Israel expressions against the folks who do that, because of course it's almost all on the left, and so it's an opportunity to go after liberals. There is no mention of anti-Semitism on the right in this document at all, even though the actual violence against Jews in America has almost overwhelmingly come from people who've been radicalized by Christian nationalism. It's clear that the document was not written by Jews because they bash Reform Judaism, but they call it Reformed Judaism, Reformed Jewish movement, they called it. And it's kind of a look, if you're not deeply involved in the Jewish community, it may feel natural to say it's Reformed Judaism. It's not Reformed. There's no ED at the end. It's just Reformed Judaism. It's good to know. And clearly there were no Jews involved, or no non-Orthodox Jews involved in the writing of this document. And they even in the document name George Soros's foundation and blame him for supporting Hamas, and which Soros does not, and name Bernie Sanders as part of what they call the Hamas caucus in Congress. It is such a political document. But this is the quote that really got to me. The American Jewish community has not demonstrated a unified resolve against the Hamas support network or its Hamas support organizations, right? That's what they're calling all of liberal, any anti-Israel activity at all. Like there's no distinction between what might be real anti-Semitism on the far left versus what might be a peace movement. And their program of Jew hatred and America hatred. Some may be blind, some Jews, right, may be blind and deaf to the manifestation of Hamas support network inspired anti-Semitism at home. Some may be in such disbelief that they cannot even acknowledge the threat. More likely, many simply do not know what to do and are waiting for leadership to guide them. In other words, we American Jews need their white Christian nationalism leadership to identify anti-Semitism. We can't identify anti-Semitism ourselves. It is a truly disturbing document that is now being potentially planned to be implemented by the folks who have come into power. So we have nothing to worry about because the only challenges we have to face is the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, which are all controlled by white Christian nationalists. I don't want to end there. We've been working, nevertheless, to try to change minds, win people over, make a difference. This is us with 3 of the Congress people that we've engaged in programming and conversation with. And coincidentally, they're all Democrats, but we'd be happy to have Republicans involved as well. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of political courage on that side of the aisle to actually step up and say this is wrong. And what we do is serve as an educational platform, again, pluralistically highlighting organizations, regardless of their Jewish denominations or even beyond the Jewish organized world. We are advocating around issues for inclusion and highlighting shared American values, including freedom and pluralism, which I still hold out hope that most Americans understand and want to see. And that's what we have to build on. So the last survey numbers that I'll share with you from PRRI is how we might be able to sway the skeptics or flip the sympathizers. Still today, of all Americans, 73% say that they would prefer the U.S. to be a nation made up of people belonging to a wide variety of religions. 73% of Americans, we can hang on to that and see hope in that. Likewise, only 27% say that they would prefer the U.S. to be a nation primarily made up of people who follow the Christian faith. Of course, among adherents, it's flipped, right? Adherents of Christian nationalism completely flip on that. And so do sympathizers. It's much more even of sympathizers. And even among the sympathizers of Christian nationalism, 46%, almost half, say they would prefer the U.S. to be a nation made up of people belonging to a wide variety of religions. What does that mean? How did these people not think of this when they were answering those initial 5 questions about Christian nationalism? There's an opportunity, and part of it, again, is about conversation, building bridges, not to the adherents necessarily, but to these sympathizers about what do they really understand about what's going on, about what they believe, about who they see Americans as. The skeptics and rejectors already understand our position. The last piece of good news, I feel that is an opportunity. The other piece here is part of the reason they have grabbed this power in such a bald-faced move is they know they're in decline. They have turned so many people off by making religion about politics that evangelical Christianity in the U.S. is in steep decline. Christianity overall in the U.S. is in steep decline, and it's a little bit hard to see, but the graph on the right shows that in 1972, 90% of Americans identified as Christian compared to 64% in 2020. And if there is no further switching of denominations out of Christianity, in 2070, it's projected that only 54% of Americans will be Christian, but the odds that there will be no more switching is highly unlikely considering how much switching continues year over year. And most of it is switching out of religion into unaffiliation with religion. Doesn't mean they no longer believe in God or magic, not necessarily, but they are no longer part of an organized religious movement. And so evangelical Christians understand this is their moment to take power, potentially never give back power, to dramatically reshape America. And it's going to be bad. It's going to continue to be bad. But the piece that I want to hold on to with some of these numbers is they're not the majority. It may take time, but it will turn back around again. But I can't leave you with, happiness and sunshine and flowers and rainbows right now, because it is a tough time. So, if you want to get involved, we would love your involvement. Jews for Secular Democracy. Some of the key issues, we didn't even touch on immigration. Sometimes it's very clearly related to church-state separation, like when they try to ban a whole religion. They've gotten, again, a little bit more subtle now. Obviously, though, repro rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, secular education, these are really pillars of the work that we've been doing. And also the science denial that gets a lot of coverage by fundamentalist religion, when really what's driving it is, I think, economic greed. But it's all intertwined. To use religion and weaponize it, it's really what it is, to dramatically remove protections from people who want to make a positive difference in the world on climate change and so many of the other issues. So I'll stop there. I see that there has been some chat, but thank you for listening to that presentation.